to.
Okay.
Want to thank everybody for coming tonight. We have Amanda Cockrell, formerly of Hollins University, and the wonderful creative writing program, children's writing program, right?
Children's
Right.
Children's and adolescents.
Right. And she's going to read from her book tonight, Shadow of the Eagle. Shadow of the Eagle. And this is beginning a new series set in Roman era Britain. And we will let you talk a little bit about your book and how you got here. And is this a pandemic book? Was this written in a pandemic?
It was written over the last year, so you could definitely call it that.
We've had a lot of people that have become authors during the pandemic.
I'm not surprised.
You're very established, so we'll let you take it away and you just.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought I'd talk just a little bit about why the Romans, and then I'm going to read a bit. And those of you who know me well know that I like the Romans because they're so appallingly like us in a lot of ways, good and bad. But just for fun, I thought I would run through 3 myths about the Romans and bust them, and then I'll read a bit. And myth number 1 has to do with color. You see all these white marble vistas and white marble statues, and they weren't white. They were painted very gaudily, in fact, a good deal. And so I even have handouts to pass around. This is Trajan's column as it looked when it was erected in Rome, and at the bottom it's what it looks like now. Isn't that interesting? And the second slightly revolting thing has to do with the notion that Romans who overate kept a special room to go throw up their dinner, which they didn't. A vomitorium is actually an exit, and you can understand the verb and how that works. It's the exit passageway in a theater or circus. So they may have done that occasionally, as people often do these days, but it wasn't a habit and it wasn't considered to be something you just did. So a vomitorium is not a room. And the third thing has to do with a minor peeve of mine, which is those god-awful wrist braces. I can see, Margaret knows, that every stage and movie Roman wears for no reason whatsoever, because they didn't. The only reason you would have one of those maybe is if you were chariot racing, would be a brace, or in a few sets of armor, there would be armor that went all the way down the arm. They developed that during the Dacian War, but nobody wore these stupid braces on their wrists. And this guy, who is stock footage from somewhere, who was picked out by my editor and their marketing team, not only was his crest, they did find somebody with the crest going the right way at my request, but he had one of those stupid braces on his arm. I asked my editor, I said, look, you guys have got to Photoshop that out, please. I have pontificated on this subject online. I will die of shame if he's got one of those things on his wrist. And so they did. They took it out.
Well, I think Kit is probably the best editor that Amanda's ever had.
Kit is wonderful, and he is the best editor I've ever had. And I hope he's listening to hear me say that. So this little thing is a cartoon I found somewhere, and it has to do with somebody saying, let's add the antiquity filter. And so what they've done is that at the top, you will see a Roman scene as it probably was, with color and buildings and rude graffiti on the walls too. And once you've applied the antiquity filter, you notice that all the color is gone. The rude graffiti are gone. The statue has a fig leaf. And on top of that, one of the guys has developed one of those stupid wrist braces.
Hey, Amanda, do you want to maybe show that to the camera too when it comes?
Oh, sure. When it comes back around. Yeah, I will. I don't know. Can the camera see that?
Yeah, bring it up a little bit.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. So send that back. Okay, so with that note, I'm going to read three little sections from toward the beginning of the book, about 20 minutes worth, all told. And this is the prologue, which certainly saves me having to explain everything. Easier just to read the prologue. The hired mourners trailed behind the carriage with the casket, wailing women in black who set Faustus's teeth on edge. The procession followed the wagon road from the house to the line of yews along the avenue, where generations of his family lay in their urns and marble boxes, topped with votive stones, the oldest of them slowly being swallowed by the grass. Faustus, in a dark gray mourning toga, with his sister Sylvia beside him in a somber gown, followed the casket ahead of the shrieking mourners. He had not wanted them, but Sylvia had insisted. What would people think if they didn't hire professional mourners to see their father off? They had had them for mother, of course, not 2 months since, but father had directed that funeral, as he had directed everything else on the farm. Now he was dead, and Faustus had two choices: accede to father's dying wishes and let the farm swallow him too, rooting him inexorably into the ground like the tombstones, or flee. The appointment to the army's Centurion training camp in Rome was tucked into the gray folds of his toga, a talisman against changing his mind. 2 days after the funeral, he signed the bill of sale that extricated him, despite Sylvia's weepy protestations. The chickens in the farmyard bobbed about his ankles in a little brown feathered tide, as Faustus threw them a last handful of grain to remember him by. You didn't have to sell it. Manlius would have married me without a dowry. Sylvia twisted her mantle round and round her hands until they looked like a chrysalis or some hapless infant swaddled by a murderous nurse. Faustus unwound her. Of course he would. He wouldn't, and Faustus knew it. Manlius wanted Sylvia, but he couldn't afford to marry a woman with no money. The farm has been in our family for 200 years, Sylvia sniffled, now using the mantle to wipe her nose. What would father think? It was his life. I don't know what father thinks because he hasn't popped up from the underworld to tell me. Father had been going to borrow money to get Sylvia married. If Faustus had done that, he would never have got free. The price of the farm had taken care of a dowry, and Sylvia was to be duly handed off to Manlius, up-and-coming quaestor of Narbo-Martius. Faustus had kept just enough cash to buy a good horse. The slaves would go with Sylvia, except for Paulus, who regarded the changes an improvement on tending cows. The Sylvia had been well enough off by Gaulish provincial standards until Faustus was 19, when Silvius Valerianus had made a few investments that he had later described as unwise, and his wife had called insane. She had died shortly thereafter of a fever, and Faustus's father had followed, as if her loss was a final dispiriting event that he could not manage. His parting words had invoked his wife's name, with more loss in his voice than Faustus would have expected. Faustus had loved his mother, but she had not always been an easy woman. She had come into the household as a slave after Claudius Caesar's invasion of Britain. Silvius Valerianus had bought her for a housekeeper and then freed and married her. Faustus's father had been big-boned and ruddy, with light brown hair and a heavy brow. His mother was pale and dark-haired, with a fine-boned face like a cat's. Faustus had his father's height, but he owed much of his looks to her, as well as the promised post in the army. She had taught her children her language, despite his father's objections, telling Silvius that she wanted someone to speak to in her own tongue, when he complained that she was a Roman now. Being a Roman was much better than being a Briton. Faustus had had to agree with that. But there was something lyrical in his mother's speech that had made him want to learn it. And as it happened, that had proved useful. Theirs was neither a family of equestrian rank nor one with a tradition of army service, and he would likely have had no chance in an immediate commission, but gone in as a rank and filer to work his way up, except for the fact that he spoke his mother's language. There was a need for British-speaking officers, now that Agricola, new governor of Britain, was planning to finish off the conquest of that province. There's a scene break here. All right, you lazy worms, take those jumps again, this time bareback. An officer who can't stay on his horse in an emergency doesn't belong in the army. Anyone who hasn't fallen off, line up for pile and practice afterward, and then we'll have a nice march down to the harbor. You've got 6 months for me to turn you into Centurion material. Faustus took his horse over the last jump and arrived still mounted, unlike a number of his fellows. If there was one thing to be grateful to the farm for, it was that he could ride practically anything and any exercise. Even a 20-mile march along the Tiber to Ostia Harbor and back was better than a life spent trying to be the brother who had died young, the one who should have inherited the farm, the one who had wanted it. Instead, Faustus now served a great empire to which everyone from the seal people of the northern islands to the little gins of the eastern desert paid fealty. Or so he was told daily during training by Mucius, a muscular centurion who looked as if he had personally conquered all of it, though he had perhaps exaggerated a bit about the northern islands, now the goal of Governor Agricola's campaign. There was only one small fly in his wine cup. On his first night in the training barracks in Rome, Faustus had been too exhausted to move, thanks to Mucius, and too excited to sleep. The combination induced a dreamlike haze in which he imagined what his father would have had to say about it all. And possibly as a result, saw his father standing at the foot of his bed. He was dressed in a toga, one arm slightly raised, the image of the paterfamilias. His form was transparent, like the first wash of a painting with details to come later, but his voice was clear. You have disgraced us. Faustus lay perfectly still and whispered, go away. 200 years, Faustus. 200 years that farm has been in our family, and you have sold it to an upstart with no breeding to go and play soldier. The buyer had been a freedman looking to come up in the world. Despite his wife's status, Silvius Valerianus didn't approve of other people changing their station in life. Faustus sat up, now more irritated than afraid, and pretty sure the apparition was imaginary. That's what Silvia said, go haunt her. Paulus, asleep on a pallet at the foot of his cot, was snoring slightly and seemed oblivious. I shall never find rest, his father said dolefully, because of you. He faded into a wisp of mist and then disappeared entirely. And this little short, very short section is where we meet some of the people on the other side. The old priest saw it in the fires of the forge. Unlike the druids of the mainland, his eyes were fixed on the human world, on the handful of islands flung across the sea north of Britain, the gods who lived in their waters, and on the words that the fire spoke. And so he talked with the traders when their ships docked at High Isle, and then thought on the invaders they had described, who had been few at first in the far south, but now multiplied like ants in the larder. When he had seen all it had to show him, he went back to his work, because the priests of the Orchides were merely ordinary men who could see farther than most into deep waters, but had a living to make in the meanwhile. After a while, as he had thought, Irian came with a plow blade to mend. Bodog was dreaming and ran it into a cleft rock and got it stuck and then beat at it with another rock, she said. Her pale brown hair was tied up under a kerchief and she wore an apron smeared with flour and grease. And so I must needs carry it to you because he is very occupied with something important. And because I called you, Canomanus said. Well, I thought you had. Irene perched herself on the work table, pushing his tools out of her way. What do the seals say in the dusk this evening? Canomanus asked. That the fishing is good. Irene smiled. Not much else. Except there is something coming. Have you told your father? Irene shook her head. He doesn't like it even when I am right. Canomanus snorted. Those who could hear the seals tease out the meaning from voices so like human ones were touched by the gods, but also feared. Irene was 12, and she had been talking to the seals since she could talk at all. Her aunts had tried to beat it out of her until Canomanus intervened. Her brothers mocked her for it, and her father refused to acknowledge it. The way that he refused to acknowledge that he had ever had a second wife who had gone back to the sea one spring morning. Keep listening, Canomanus told us. The seals will know when it comes. Irene thought about that, walking home from the village with a mended blade. The wind blew the seals' voices up from the rocks on the shore across the nearly treeless heath. When it did come, she still wouldn't tell her father Phelan, or Bodok or Ogun either. Whatever it was, they would no doubt fight it out without her. She gave Bodok the blade, stuck her tongue out at him when he didn't bother to thank her, and went to start their supper. The old aunts had stopped coming by to help keep the house, scold Phelan for a fool, and inspect the baby's fingers as soon as Iron was old enough to do the work herself. Something coming, the seals cried again. Something coming. And then this last bit, which is a little longer, is from part way in to Faustus's first winter in Britain. There's been one battle, and now they're settled into winter quarters because there's really not much campaigning that can be done, but there are plenty of other things. Excuse me. Winter quarters, Faustus found, might as well have been summer quarters, only with worse weather. Drills and march assigned whenever it wasn't actually freezing. In between, Faustus and his century were assigned to go and inspect the gold mines at Dolichothi in the Siluri Hills, since the overseers were Roman, but the miners were Britons. And it was useful for a native speaker to be sure they were not skimming or otherwise cheating their masters. The natives had mined the site for centuries, washing gold from their hills with water from the nearby stream. But the former governor, Julius Frontinus, an engineer at heart, had begun the installation of modern mining methods before his transfer. Several aqueducts were now installed, with water tanks and a hydraulic trip hammer to crush the ore, and water wheels to drain the deep mines. Faustus's century was quartered for the duration of their stay, and a new camp at Luentinum nearby, an uncomfortable assortment of turf and timber buildings with no heat. The mine workers were mostly not slaves, but conscripts from the peace treaty made with the Siluris, bound to service for varying terms. Faustus watched them with an odd sense of something seen before. They were smaller and darker haired than the Ordovikis, fine-boned and stubborn-looking, his mother's people. Their accent was very like hers. They remained unimpressed by his ability to mimic it, and made the sign of horns behind his back every time he turned away, so Septimus reported. I don't like them, Septimus said. Well, they don't like you, Faustus replied philosophically, or me. We're just here to see that buckets of ore don't walk away. He settled on a rock near the shaft being worked and pulled his military cloak more tightly around his shoulders against a dank fog. He fished in his pack for the noon meal he'd assembled in the morning. Cold venison from a recent hunting expedition, an army biscuit, a hard bread that took good teeth to cope with. The letter from Sylvia emerged with it, an unnervingly thick stack of wooden tablets tied with cord. It had caught up with him that morning, and he hadn't read it yet, regarding it much as he would a basilisk egg. A letter from home, Septimus asked. Maybe someone's died and left you money. That's a thick one, he eyed it curiously. Go and supervise something, please. Yes, Centurion. Septimus saluted and departed, dodging an ore cart coming up from the dark opening in the rock beside them. To my dear brother, Faustus Silvius Valerianus, greetings. We are well, and Nanlius also sightings. You will be unhappy to know that the farm has been let go to ruin. The new people have not even plowed the south field, and the peach trees have a blight. You know that father always burns straw in the orchard every spring for that. The cistern is clogged too. How on earth did she know that? They haven't made any offering to Ceres or Saturn to Culminating either, and you know that father was scrupulous about that. I do not know what will come of it all. It is most distressing, as I am now expecting a child. I fear it will affect the baby in some horrible way. I have been to the midwife for an amulet, and also to the temple of Juno Lucina and made sacrifice, and also to Diana, but I fear the worst. How in the name of Fama, goddess of gossip, did she know what those people were doing? And why was she lurking about the farm? Faustus glared at the tablets. There were 6 more. He scanned them, hoping for some other news, and sifted out only that the baby was due early in the year. He would send her a present, he thought, and make an offering to Juno himself. Childbirth always required careful management and propitiation of the proper gods. But he was reasonably certain that the state of the farm was not going to affect a baby 10 miles away in Narbo Martius. He hoped not. He didn't need something else for his family to hang around his neck. Faustus bit irritably into the army biscuit and became aware of someone watching him. It took him a moment to see her, a slight dark-haired creature in a ragged shift among the dark trees beyond the mine entrance. He took out a piece of the venison and saw her eyes follow it. He held the venison out, but she wouldn't come to him. After a moment, he stood and went toward her carefully, slipping deep shade of ancient oaks through drifts of wet leaves. She retreated, but only out of sight of the mine workers, And when he held out the venison this time, she took it and gnawed at it ravenously. Are you hungry? She nodded. We're always hungry. What's your name? She was tiny, the height of a 9-year-old, but the thin frame under the ragged shift was that of a girl in her teens. Her brown arms and forehead were tattooed with faint blue patterns, loops and spirals, not unlike those of the Silures, but she wasn't one of them. Her eyes were startling blue. Curlew, her voice was curiously accented and slightly sing-song, as if the Silure dialect might not be her native speech. Who are your people? Not these. She glanced at the Silure mine workers contemptuously. We were here before they came, or the tall, fair ones either, the Sun people. We will be here when they have gone, she added, whatever they think. Or the Romans, with their iron swords and shells like turtles. She nodded at his Lorica. Something half remembered that his mother had told him about the little dark ones, the she people who lived in the hills, came back to him. Misty as a bedtime tale. Maybe it had been. I see. Why were you watching me? Was it just the venison? She had finished it and wiped her mouth on her hand. No, and I need to tell grandmother about you. Someone at the mine shaft cursed angrily, and Faustus turned to see what the trouble was. When he turned again, she was gone. There was no sight of her retreating back among the trees, just a stillness under the bare branches. The cursing intensified, and he gave it his attention. The Silure mine foreman stood beside the top pair of the monstrous water wheels that drained the mine. He was shaking with fury. The wheels were motionless, their operators lounging in the lee of the tunnel opening. What is the problem here? Faustus asked him. The little beast jammed rocks between the spokes and put it just enough out of true that it hangs up every turn. What little beast? And they look all right to me. The little beast of a mine slave, and not these here, the bottom ones, of course, the bottom ones, so everything stopped. Let me have a look. Faustus edged past the wheels and another ore cart being loaded from the pulley-raised buckets and started gingerly down into the shaft, gripping the handholds carved in the wall. Behind him, the great wheels stood still. There were 6 pairs of them going stair-step down beside the shaft to drain the workings at the bottom. Each pair lifted water to its own height, where it flowed into a sump to be lifted again by the next pair, driven by men walking atop them to turn the wheels with their feet. With the bottom set still, the rest sat motionless too, looming over him in the dim light. I'd been on mine shafts before, but he hadn't liked it. It was too much like crossing the Styx, particularly at the bottom, where the water that seeped in everywhere flowed about their feet if the wheels weren't turning. Once into the tunnel that followed the ore vein, the only light came from oil lamps set into niches in the stone. The problem with the bottom pair of wheels was obvious. A handful of rock had been shoved between one set of double spokes that radiated from the hub to either edge of the wheel and pounded into place with the head of a pick, breaking 2 spokes and splintering several more. Out of true, the wheel slobbered half its water it caught back into the sump before it got to the top. It would take the engineers to come down and fix it, or it would have to be disassembled and hauled to the top. The Silure foreman was hard on Faustus's heels. He grabbed a slave who sat shivering in the water beside the wheel, guarded by the other miners, and slammed him against the wall of the tunnel. The slave was small, brown-skinned, naked except for a ragged tunic and an iron collar, and marked on his arms and forehead with spiral patterns in blue woad. He looked older than the child from the woods, but he had a look of her, Faustus thought. One of the same people? The foreman lifted him to hurl him at the wall again, and Faustus grabbed his arm. Stop it, you'll kill him. I don't care, sneaking little ferret. They're all like that. They do it for spite. Well, I care, Faustus said. He belongs to the mine and therefore to Rome, and he's not worth anything dead. I'll send the engineer down to see if this can be repaired on site, or if you're going to have to take it down. You're like to see fish swim by in a half day if he can't, the Silure man said. In the meantime, do what you can with one wheel then, Faustus told him, before it gets too deep. He considered the slave. If he left him down here, the foreman would probably kill him despite his orders. You follow me up top, and I'll decide what to do about you there. He found Septimus among the crowd gathered around the shaft to offer unsolicited advice on the situation, and handed the culprit over to him. Hang on to him until I've the engineer. The engineer went down into the mine with 3 assistants, sent one of them back up for more tools, and finally came up himself, shaking his head. I've stabilized her for now, but it's a stopgap job, and we need to send a new wheel down to replace that one. I've told them to get ready to swap when it gets there. I understand one of their mine slaves did that. What have you done with him? Nothing yet. Well, give him a good beating and put him to work breaking up ore or something. Don't send him back down on the works. Once one gets the idea of sabotage, it spreads to the rest, and we don't need any more of that. That seemed like sound advice. But when Faustus went to collect the man from Septimus, he was gone. Where is he? Right here, Septimus said. Never left my side. Oh, shit. Has he gone invisible then? He was here, I swear it. He was here just now when I saw you coming over. I was looking at him. I suppose they'll dock our pay for that, Faustus said. Your pay, he added pointedly. The little man was definitely gone, faded into the woods the same way the girl had. Not if you don't mention it, Septimus suggested. It's iffy who he belonged to, isn't it? Us or the Silures? And we're rotating out of this post tomorrow anyway. Faustus stared at the empty woods, wondering for an instant if the little slave had even been there in the first place. But of course he had. Septimus certainly had. The sense of invisible things floating about his head might be making him slightly mad, he decided. He had thought that his father's shade had gone back to where it was supposed to be after the fighting at Brenipona, but this morning it had arrived at Laurentinum along with the letter. He had caused just a glimpse of it, barely visible against the pale plastered wall of the barracks. Paulus had been there and had maintained what Faustus thought was a suspiciously blank expression. He still wasn't sure whether Paulus could see the apparition too, and for that matter, whether it actually existed at all. If anyone asks you about that slave, you tell them the commander is still making his mind up, he said. I'm going to be making it up until we leave. The Siluri Hills made the back of his neck itch. Thank you. It's always interesting trying to pick out something to read that doesn't take too much explanation. One of the reasons for picking the prologue. Are there questions or anything anybody wants to ask me? Yeah.
Who is the audience for your novel?
I think mainly Roman history buffs, but I hope very much for more females among the audience than Roman military fiction usually has, because there are a lot of women in this book and they have things to do.
They really do. This is one of the things I really love about your books. And I've read all of Amanda's Centurion books as well, including the first two that she wrote. And what I really like about your books is that they've got people in them. I mean, genuine human beings. They're very dimensional. They're very non-conventional. You know, I think that I look at the way, for example, that some of your the theme of somebody not quite fitting into what their parents expect of them, somebody not quite fitting into what their culture expects of them, and not quite fitting into what, I don't know, just not quite fitting in, and that makes it very appealing.
Well, familial duty was a big thing in Roman culture, and the pater familias, the male head of the family, had enormous authority and influence. And Faustus is a bad son for doing what he's done.
I love though that he was willing to sell the farm to get rid of his sister.
Well, he really wanted to get rid of the farm.
So he could go off and join the army.
He really wanted to get rid of the farm and not have to have it, but he wasn't going to get his sister married off if he didn't, he could have sold them and paid the debts and had some money left over if he hadn't put the rest of it into Sylvia's dowry.
I have to say that reading Sylvia's letter, it was so fast to get rid of that woman, it would have been
Sylvia will grow on us. Sylvia shows up in book 2, which I'm halfway through writing.
Seriously?
And it's a gigantic pain in the ass. But she comes around. Yeah, she comes around.
Oh, good. I'm about 80% of the way through. We've been through the Battle of Mount Mons Gravis in my reading, but we've gone to the climax. We haven't yet come to the denouement. So that's what I'm reading at the moment. But it's such a wonderful
It's interesting to read from this while I'm in the middle of writing the second book. I spent a lot of time checking the final manuscript of this book for what color was his hair? Between my first novel, The Legions of the Mist, and The Wall at the Edge of the World, which is kind of a sequel to it, although a standalone book, given that there was a 40-year gap between the two, I probably shouldn't feel too bad about it. But I turned a small, dark man into a tall redhead from one book to the other. And I have been paranoid about this kind of thing ever since.
This is why you need a Venn diagram of all of them.
I really do. And, you know, and I reread Legions before I wrote the sequel, of course, not being an idiot, but somehow I missed that this particular tribal chieftain had been described in one way. And
You know, isn't it the beauty of a trilogy getting back to kind of an unappealing character that you can slowly transition that individual? And
yeah, because what's the point in a character who's unappealing forever?
Yeah.
You know,
What about true to life?
if they don't, well, I know, but you gotta let them grow up a little bit. You know, when I wrote the Centurions series in the 80s, I was working for a book packager, and the Lyle Engel, the mad genius behind book creations, never met a cliche he didn't like. So he gave me this assignment of writing a book about two brothers, half brothers, sons of a noble father, one of whom is the son of the legitimate wife, and the other the son of the beautiful slave girl. And the slave girl's son is better in every way than, you know, and Lyle. So I thought, and the intended bride of the legitimate brother really falls in love with the other brother, and, you know, cliche after cliche after cliche. And so I just said, okay, I can deal with this. And so I made the beautiful slave girl an absolute twit, and made the intended bride somebody that the slave-born brother really should never marry because she's totally incapable of following anyone on a campaign, you know, and he's destined for the army once his father frees him and adopts him. And the resentful legitimate brother, over the space of 4 books, grows up to be somebody quite his own person. His problem has been having to try to live up to his father, when his father is an army guy and the illegitimate son is too. And this other son is really destined to be a diplomat. He's a terrible field commander, but he's a great diplomat. But oh Lord, when Lau first gave me the plot for this, I don't know. He always did that kind of thing. I had an argument with him. I wrote 2 books in a Viking series for him, and I had an argument with him about sea serpents that went on. This was pre-email. This was mail back and forth that went on for months, with me resisting putting a sea serpent in the blasted book. He sent me things of Ripley's Leave It or Not, one of a giant squid that was hung over some British vicar's shower bath. We finally settled on his squid.
We have a couple of questions from online.
Yeah.
Kathy Hankler is online, and she wants
thank
to
you, Kathy.
know, how did you get such minute day-to-day detail of what they do? How did you research to get that?
A lot of reading, but a lot of wondering. The internet is a wondrous thing. I can look. What I couldn't do when I was writing these books in the 80s is just go online and say things like, did the Romans have window glass? But there are a couple of marvelous books about just daily life in the Roman Empire. One of them is called How to Manage Your Slaves, and it's written as a sort of parody, but all the stuff in it is factual.
That's a wonderful book.
And it's a terrific book. And another one that I love is called Pagan Holiday. And it's about the vacation coast of the Bay of Naples and all the things that went on there, the expensive villas of the rich and the yachts that were moored in the bay, and the public baths, and the entertainment on the dock, and the jugglers, and the whorehouses, and the everything that you would expect a seaside resort to have. And that was just crawling with detail.
Lana Whited is also on the call, and she wants to know how you know for sure that they said shit.
Well, it's a loose translation, Lana. I think probably, as you know, as the French have nerd, I think probably every language had something similar. What I've tried to do with the language is write as if I was doing a literary translation from the original language, which in this case would be either Latin or, in the case of the Britons, or very early Brittonic, which obviously I don't speak. I've tried to stay away from contemporary references, so there's some curses I wouldn't use, but I think shit's pretty universal.
I think so too. And hey, it's historical fiction.
Well, yeah, but you don't want to do anything that's unlikely or jarring. And there have been some things that, for instance, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I could call a flower that was known as a European marigold, a calendula, rather than the New World marigold. But I couldn't call it a marigold because the origins of marigold is Mary's gold. It's a Christian image. And this is like 79 AD by Christian reckoning. And I finally settled for calendula because marigold just jarred me when I saw it.
I read a book one time and there was a bunch of what I thought anachronisms in it. And I was like, these people are just stupid. And then I realized I was getting reeled right in. It was post-apocalyptic. So everything sounded like it was in the olden days and they referred to plastic, but it was stuff
But it was
in the future. So yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read a couple of books that sort of intrigued me in what it would be like, what would happen to the language post-apocalypse. And probably my desert island book, my all-time favorite book ever, is Ridley Walker, which is written in a kind of exploded English that's Russell Hoban's take on what the language would be like. And that's fascinating. It's a little hard to get into, but once you get the flow of it. And another one I read recently is The Wake, which is set in right around the time of William the Conqueror. And I can't remember the author's name. It's gone right out of my head. But that is written in what he calls a kind of ghost language of Old English, because you can't write it in Old English. But he's tried to keep a lot of the feel of it and a lot of the words in it. And that one took a little getting into too, in terms of being able to read it. Yeah.
As you write a trilogy and you're on the second book, do you try to make them standalone as well?
Yes, I try to make them standalone, but I also, there's continuity. That there are people in this book that show up in book 2, and we find out what happened next. I try to make it so you can pick up a book and work in enough backstory without the expository lump being, just blorped onto the first page. And you tend to think, if you know it's a series, you tend to think a couple of books out. For instance, I think I know what I'm going to do with Sylvia in book 3. And just before this went to press, I emailed my editor and I said, can we change one word? It would really help me if this child is 2 years older, because I need her in book 2 and I need her 2 years older, which her age is only mentioned once. Can we change 4 to 6? And he said, yeah, we can do that. Yeah. But it would have been, I would have had to live with it if it had been later. It had been later than that. But it's very hard. Well, she would be a little too sexually precocious if I hadn't stuck those 2 years on her.
Authors have to be so detailed.
Well, and the ancient world is bad enough for very young brides. And actually, when the copy editor was going through this, she pointed out that could I make it clear how old my hero is, because he's just got it on with a 17-year-old. And I said, well, actually she's 18, but yeah, I'll make it clear. But that's normal. I just hope nobody goes up back to Centurions book 2 and counts on their fingers and figures out that Agricola 15. But that's, well, yeah, in a number of ways, but that's the ancient world. I belong to a couple of Roman interest Facebook groups. And sometimes I wish they would just throw all the guys out, because you can't post, nobody can post a statue or a painting without a bunch of penis jokes, and it gets old. But on the other hand, they were big on that. They for graffiti, for good luck, wind chimes, amulets, you name it. And so I brought this, and now that everybody's sort of had a chance to.
Oh my goodness.
That kind of thing. Door knockers, and so they're carved all over Hadrian's wall, both just as the sort of normal graffiti, the sort of thing people do now, and also as apopatreic, for good luck, for protection.
When you write details, do you come across details though that are like, oh, nobody would believe this, even if they that you feel can't use because they don't?
If they did it, I'll use it.
Mhm.
If they did it, I will.
Truth is stranger than fiction part,
I will
yeah.
use it. Yeah, and I've found some surprising things. One of the things that was fascinating, and I haven't been able to use because it's just a little too far ahead, was I've got somebody fishing in this book, and I Googled, did the Romans have fly fishing? Well, it turns out yes, they did, but not till around 200. And and I even found out where the first person tied flies, and when they would have adopted, aristocratic, sport guys that are fishing, not for lunch, but country gentlemen, when they would have adopted a tied fly. And it's somewhere around 200, but it was too late.
I really enjoyed your young adult novel.
Well, thank you.
Are you going to do any more contemporary writing, or are you just writing as things come to you?
Well, right now I got a contract with Canelo, bless their buttons, for 3 books. So that's what I'm working on. I have a contemporary novel that I've been working on for years and years and years, and have been trying to get it to come right. So that one's up in the air. Probably not another. I never managed to sell another young adult novel.
Well, that one is out of print, and it's
I know.
once in a while I can find a used copy because I just loved it and love to sell it to people.
Well, I've got 25 copies.
Well, can I have 22 of them? And then we of course do a lot of hand selling, and when people want a young adult that will appeal to adults.
If you can sell them, yeah. They said we're going to shred them if you don't want them, and offered it to me at much less than the normal author's discount. But I thought, well, that's tacky. Every other publisher I've ever had that took a book out of print just said, do you want these? We'll give them to you. Instead of saying, we're going to shred them if you don't pay for them. So I got 25 copies. And yeah, I'll bring you some.
If you haven't read it, let me see if I can get the title right. What we keep is not always what will stay.
Yep.
Okay.
I love that.
Yeah.
It was originally called The Untied Church of Dog, from a bumper sticker that she sees that says, dyslexics, remember that dog loves you. A message from the Untied Church of Dog, which is in the book. And I love that. And my editor at Flux pointed out that every single person who goes looking for your book will type United and not Untied, and they won't find it. And we're changing the title. And I had to admit the legitimacy in that.
Don't know of it. Can you just sum it up real quick?
Oh, goodness.
Or I'll sum it up the way I tell people about it. It's about the young girl who dates a fellow who's in high school, but he has come back to high school. He served in the army.
Yeah, his father signed for him to go in before he graduated, and he come almost immediately, has a leg blown off and comes back.
So here he is as a senior, but his life experience is totally different than the people he's in school with. And I really like the way
that's interesting. And what I would have described it as, which also fits, is this kid has been her trouble statue of St. Felix in the basement of her church for years. And all of a sudden one day she goes down there and he steps off his pedestal and talks to her. and insists he really is Saint Felix, that God figured out he wasn't a saint and unsainted him. And she thinks, and he's probably a somewhat damaged Vietnam veteran who's been living in the basement. But where's the statue? Which never turns up. So you never really know what he is. So there's a little magical realist twist to it. I had that part first.
Okay.
Before I had Jesse, the 19-year-old boy.
And if I do come up with some copies, I will let you guys know.
Well, I will bring you some. Yeah, I have.
I have a list of books that are out of print that every so often I go out and see what's on the used market and stuff.
I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I couldn't stand not to get some
Oh,
since
yeah.
they were taking it out of print, and I didn't have the money to fork over for,
Yeah. I don't know what
the whole
people
bunch.
think of this, but sometimes publishers may not like that. We'll go very deep in the backlist. If it's a book we love, we don't care how long it's been out there. We want to keep selling it. So
Well, I think anything you sell by me that somebody likes, they'll look for other books by me.
That's
So I don't
exactly
think, I
right,
can't
yeah.
imagine Kid having a problem with that. It's interesting. Marketing is such an interesting thing. This wasn't the original cover, or it wasn't the original cover design. The original cover design had the eagle taking almost a third of the top of it. And being the smart people that they are, the marketing folks at Cannell ran this by retailers. And the retailers all said, this reads YA.
Oh, interesting.
And so they changed it on that advice.
but
And-
not the book.
No, not the book. The
Wow.
cover reads YA, not the book.
Now, was the Roman, I mean, was the eagle clearly, I mean, was it a natural eagle? or
Yeah, it
it
was a natural, no, it was a natural eagle.
And that makes sense. You see a lot of that kind of stuff in fantasy
Yeah,
stuff with
that's
young
true.
adults.
And I think they felt that without, that there was, I don't know why but the retailers know.
I'm glad they did that because we do see books in here, and there was one from a big publisher last year that just totally blew it. I mean, it was a beautiful cover, but it was never going to attract the right reader. It looked very sci-fi-ish, really, and it turned out the book was historic fiction set in the court of Ellen of Aquitaine. And I'm like, the wrong person is never going to pick that book
No,
up.
they're not. And that
Yeah.
always just breaks my heart because I love fantasy covers.
Yeah.
I like fantasy covers honestly much more than I like most of the historical fiction covers. But you got to put something on the cover that's going to tell the reader what they're getting. I love illustration covers rather than photograph covers too.
I think they sell
But
better.
they all say fantasy, you know, in there.
So if a person wanted to read one of your Viking books, how would they go about finding one of your Viking books?
They are long out of print.
If you give us the titles.
Oh
we
my
run
God.
into- If you want them read. We've got access to some databases where people buy out stock of an old.
Oh, that's
store or
funny.
something. And so I found.
Only
one-
if you only sell volumes 3 and 4 of the 4-volume
Okay.
series, because I didn't write 1 and 2.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the original manuscript from the original author for book 2 was so bad that Book Creations fired him. I think it was
Oh
a
my
him,
gosh.
and paid me $1,000 to do a rewrite in 2 weeks on book 2.
Oh, my goodness.
So book 2 is marginally better than it would have been, but I always write those 2, 3
Did
and
they have
4.
your name on
No, it's Eric Nielsen.
them? Okay.
I shouldn't have said that. No, I will admit to anything. You know, I wrote a bunch of stuff for them. I even wrote a seething, steaming, romantic
Well,
antebellum novel
there
for
are
them.
some publishers that are taking books that were quote out of print, and because of the better quality print on demand, they're putting things back in print.
Oh, yeah.
Which is great. Yeah, for books that have, you know, you thought, you know, I've recently got one. I had always just tracked down used ones and found it was back in print. So
Yeah, I've got the ones I wrote for the book package. Unfortunately, I don't have the copyright to.
yeah.
I jumped through huge hoops to get the copyright to Centurions back, but it has to be 35 years after it was published, and nothing else was that old.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Question, why do you use a pseudonym?
That goes,
For these books, I can see if you were writing a romance.
no, that goes back to the book. So I got a contract with Book Creations in the 80s to write a romance series for them. I wanted to quit. I was a copywriter at a rock radio station, and I wanted to quit my job and have babies before I got too old. So I sent my first Roman novel, which Athenaeum published, to them and said, how would you like a Roman series? And they did. But they always put pseudonyms on their books because they had had the experience of a guy with his real name on it, wrote a very popular series and then got bored with it and wouldn't write anymore.
Oh,
So they want to
could
be
use
able
the
to
same
continue the
name,
series
even with
with a different author under the same name. So they put a pseudonym on it and picked a male name, of course, because it was military. It was Roman adventure, so it had to be a guy, naturally. But when Canello picked him up, they discovered that Damion Hunter, that the pseudonym had some name recognition among Roman fans, and you don't waste name recognition. So we settled on, but I had said, I want my name on anything else from now on, no more pseudonyms. So we settled on Amanda Cockrell writing as Damion Hunter. And that struck me as a reasonable approach. You know, it's got my name on it.
Does the Y, I can't remember, does the Y have your name?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good.
Everything I have done, including the last two trilogies for book creations, which were American Southwest, Pre-Columbian, those have my name on them.
So how many books have you written altogether?
Oh my Lord. Okay. This is 33.
Oh, I want to write so many, I forget how many.
Well, a lot of them were, I did 10 in a series for the book packager of Family Saga, a series called The Holtz. And it was a spinoff from another series written by somebody else under the same pseudonym with the children of the previous series, like a TV spinoff. It's strange. And I wrote 10 of those.
Is that more journeyman's work kind of stuff? Is that how you?
Well, I don't regard, I never regard it that way. You write the best book you can write, because if you phone it in, you learn bad habits. And besides that, anything you write makes you a better writer. I am a much better writer for having written 10 novels in that family saga. I am a much better developer of character. I have a much better ear for language. You know, I learned a lot from that.
Your Viking book wouldn't possibly be by Eric Nielsen Hakon, would it?
Yes, it would, but
Amazon has it.
holy,
Sorry, Carl.
forgetting the microphone.
If Amazon has it, book no further to definitely get it.
Very good.
Only volumes 3 and 4. You'd sell 1 and 2 and tell anybody I wrote them, I'll sue.
Yes, if they can get it, we can get it. We can get some things we can't get elsewhere.
Okay, not admitting to anything else here.
But I want to read
We
the
had
Viking
some,
book.
Yeah, Terry, I'll lend you my copies.
we had some Beth Macy books. They printed in Great Britain, the cover with Michael Keaton on it. They didn't print that here. So I got with the bookstore in London and they sent them to me and we had them, and the Big A didn't have them. So some Barnes and Noble friends came in and they said, we didn't get that. And I'm like, no, you didn't.
No, you
They were- well, we had local people in the, that were in the movie and wanted that cover.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
we were
of
really excited to
course.
get that. So
I have a
That's great.
question for you, Loris, about ebooks and print books.
Mhm.
If someone goes to your bookstore's site
yes.
and sees an ebook listed and it clicks through to Kobo or something, do you get a bit?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
We're partnership with them and
So we should,
sometimes you'll notice in the web address of the page,
Mhm.
our name is in it, or there's a number that refers
okay,
to us.
good.
Yes, but we do.
So it is also possible to get ebooks from you, because
Right. Mhm.
why not get
And
them?
we do Libro FM, which is audiobooks. And they work with 1,500 bookstores around the country to offer that service through the websites. So it's great.
Are those,
It's the essentially that other company's thing, but
are they,
We actually
are
have-
things that are available as Audible books, are those?
Yep. they have a huge database. And when you go there, you're asked to affiliate with a local bookstore.
Ah, very
And
good.
They're very much,
Yeah.
the amount of support.
Because all my Roman books are out in audiobook now
Oh, good.
too. Yeah.
Do you
Okay.
have a link to that on your website? Then?
Yeah, or if
Okay.
you go to any book, there
Okay.
is, sure which menu it's under, but if you go to a book and see, you know, it's, I don't know if it says other formats are also available in or something like that,
Okay.
you'll see it. And my must reads is the one that we use, you see the most for digital books.
Mhm.
We have another question from the computer gallery. Kathy asks Amanda, this is Kathy Hancock, asks Amanda, can you talk about your writing legacy from your parents?
Well, yeah, my parents were writers. My father was a screenwriter. They started out writing short stories in the 30s during the Depression, when my father found out he could actually write short stories and sell them to magazines when there was a big market. And they eventually wound up in California and wrote screenplays, and my mother wrote novels. And some screenplays. They wrote a lot of the old half-hour Alfred Hitchcock shows. They wrote 2 episodes of the Adam West Batman, which I always use when someone says, tell us something that we don't know about you. I say, well, my father. One of them featured the Joker, but one of them featured a villain that Mother made up called the Minstrel, who sang all of his nefarious plans to Gilbert and Sullivan tunes.
That is
But the one of Mother's books that's still out and about is the one children's book she wrote, a fairy tale called Shadow Castle. And that still sells. We republished it through the Authors Guilds back in print, and it still sells a few copies. Yeah, it's the author's expanded edition with 2 whole storylines not in the original book, which was our way of getting around Barracuda Books, who are aptly named, who discovered that the copyright had been let lapse and republished it on their own hook, and we couldn't do anything. This was before the copyright law was changed to 75 years plus life of the author, and the publisher had let it lapse, and Mother had never known. So we republished it with these 6 chapters, 2 storylines that had been cut for length from the old McGraw-Hill edition as Author's Expanded Edition. And it has the original illustrations because we did a copyright search, and that had lapsed too. So
I remember asking you during the class I took from you at Hollins, why you didn't become a screenwriter like your parents.
did I tell you that the aggravation factor was too high?
You know, you said it was pretty horrible
Didn't want to do that
place
to
to
your
be,
children, right?
Right.
I didn't want to do it to me.
Mhm.
Children are sort of oblivious. It's writing full time, whether it's novels or screenplays. The only time I've ever made enough to actually make a living was when I wrote for the book packager, and I wrote 2 and sometimes 3 books a year for them. But otherwise, I've always had a day job. When I was growing up, one year I got a horse for my birthday, and another year we had a little trouble affording my school clothes. You just never knew. I thought everybody went to the unemployment office with their father on Monday mornings when he didn't have an assignment. So, and Daddy's stories of Hollywood. He, I forget which Western he was writing for. It might've been High Chaparral. But anyway, his agent got hold of him and said, Frank, baby, producer wants you to put another Indian in this. And he said, what do you mean he wants me to put another Indian in it? Agent said, well, he thinks there should be another Indian. What should this Indian be doing? He doesn't care. He just wants another Indian in it. He probably had a nephew or something he wanted to give a role to. Who knows? Maybe it was a bet. Anyway, gnashing his teeth, Daddy wrote another Indian into the script. And there was a famous instance that the screenwriter Sterling Sullivan wrote about in an issue of TV Guide. I wish I still had that. I saved it for years. He had written a screenplay for something or other, and the producer wanted him. It was a beach scene. It was a romantic beach scene set in the Caribbean on the beach. And the producer wanted him to put a bear on the beach to up the tension. And Sullivan pointed out that there aren't any bears in the Caribbean. The producer didn't care. Lyle Engel would have said, we'll write a disclaimer. That was his famous thing when he wanted a bear on the beach. I don't know whether Sullivan was well known and had a lot of clout. He might have got away with no bear. I'm not sure. I can't remember whether he said he did it or not. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
But that kind of thing, if you think that you might occasionally have small disagreements with your editor, which doesn't apply to Kit Neville the Wonderful, I'll tell you, but has applied to some previous editors. I had one who thought that he knew more about Roman military tactics than I did, being male. And he changed flank to wing and flank all the way through. And I pitched a blue fit and got them changed back. You know, if you think that that kind of thing makes you crazy, just wait and see what a director and a bunch of actors and a producer with a nephew who needs a role can do to your screenplay. So that's why I never wanted to write screenplays.
Well, we want to thank you for coming.
Well,
This has
thank you
been
for
great.
having me.
And as always, the discussion is so interesting. So I regret that I never got to do one of your classes, but we will have some other events coming up. We hope everybody can join us. We have one next Friday night with Suzanne Strick. She's done a nature book on the state of Virginia. It's called The Middle Somewhere, because everywhere is home to something or somebody.
Well, that's
So
cool.
it's
I
going
like
to be at
that.
Unity Church, the Roanoke Valley, and then we're having, just got firmed up today. There's a Henry Yampolsky from Salem, and he works at Virginia Tech. He's got written a book on dissolving, he calls it conflict, and dissolving conflict. And we're going to do a little more of a workshop format on how to talk to people that maybe you have
Great
conflicts.
job.
That'll be fun. Some other things later this summer. So
That's
thank you very
great.
much.
Thank you. Okay, are we off
I can take
camera?
one of these and pay up here.